Chapter 3. The Calm Before the Storm. Such is the tale of Fenrir, Ronin finished. Storm stared quietly at the flames flickering in the dark. He had never heard a story that resonated with him as much as Fenrir's, and he found himself with a strong feeling of inspiration. "Wow," said Caim finally. "I think that's my favorite story you've ever told us." Ronin smiled. "I thought you might like it." "He has the same dream as me," said Storm. "I always knew it would be hard to become the greatest swordsman to ever live, but if I have to surpass Fenrir, I'm going to have to try my absolute hardest." "That you will," said Ronin. "It is an ambitious dream to say the least, but I think it fits you like a glove, Storm. There will be moments where you feel like all is lost, and in those moments, you will know that there was at least one other who made the impossible possible." "Nah, Grandpa," said Caim. "You said that when we pass our final swordsmanship test, you would give us our first swords. Do you think we'll be ready? I mean, you've only let us use wooden swords up until now." Ronin took a long, steady breath, staring into the pits of the fire. "That is a difficult question to answer," he said. "But I think it's time you boys knew the truth of the matter." Storm and Caim both glanced up. "The truth?" Ronin looked at them one by one. "I was lying when I said you would be given your swords upon completing the final test." "Lying?" Caim cried, jumping to his feet. "So, we don't get our swords after all? We have to chase gnowls and go down to the darkness and face ourselves?" Storm merely stared at the old man quietly, waiting for him to elaborate. "Not quite," said Ronin. "For it is only with real swords that your final test can be given. The acquiring of your swords is a symbol of the danger that you will face in conquering the trial. It is the final stepping stone from an apprentice to a swordsman." Storm's eyes widened. "Wait, you don't mean..." Caim sat there blankly, staring at his grandfather, waiting for him to say what he hoped he would say. "Caim, take a seat," said Ronin. "I want you boys to look into the depths of this fire and tell me what you see." Storm sat up straight and stared into the flames. He watched as they licked the wood, and soon found that the tongues of flame were similar to the wind itself. They were elusive, irregular, and impossible to catch. But deep within the flames, lying amongst the wood and the coal, were two strange stones that caught his eyes. "There's something other than wood in the fire," said Caim. Ronin smiled. "Yes, there is." Storm focused and found that each stone was about the size of his palm, with flames dancing around them. "For each and every sword that is tempered," Ronin began, "the blacksmith creates whetstones to match each of the blades. Look at them like a sheath to a sword. A sword can only be sheathed by its proper counterpart, for the sheath was built with one purpose and one purpose alone." "Those are our whetstones," whispered Storm. "You're giving us our blades?" Caim asked, looking up at Ronin with all the innocence of a child. "I am not giving you anything," Ronin answered. "You must earn your swords, as Fenrir had to." "Figures," muttered Storm. "First, I want you boys to fetch 2 bowls of water from the cabin and return here." At that, both brothers jumped up, scrambling over one another until they made it to the door, and laughed as they waltzed inside. Soon after, they each returned with a bowl of water. They sat down on their knees with their hands resting on top of their legs. "The first step is to test your resolve," said Ronin. "I want each of you, at the same time, to reach into the flames and pull out one of the whetstones. If at any point in time you drop the stone in fear of getting burned, you will fail the test, and you will have to wait an entire cycle before you are given the same opportunity again." "An entire cycle?" Caim yelped, looking up at Ronin with frantic eyes. "I can't wait that long. I've already been waiting for this since I was a kid." "Then you shouldn't let go of the stone when you pull it out," said Ronin, pouring himself another cup of wine. He took a sip, watching the 2 boys carefully. Storm's eyes were focused and calm. Shaking out his hand in preparation, he looked at his brother. "Come on, Caim, we can do this. I don't care if it burns all the skin off my hands. They're already numb anyway from the climb earlier." Caim grinned at his brother's confidence and nodded his head. "On 3 then. 1, 2, and the both of them raised their hands above the flames. They could feel the heat already, and bits of angst swelled up inside their chests. 3, they cried together, thrusting their hands into the fire. Storm felt a burn far beyond what he had imagined when grasping the stone, and upon trying to pull it out, realized it was much heavier than he thought. Heaving with all his might, Storm pulled the stone out of the fire at the same time as Caim. Everything in his body told him to drop the stone. Forcing back all visceral thoughts, Storm gripped it as tightly as he could and closed his eyes. It was then that he realized the whetstone was not hot at all, only about as tepid as lukewarm water. "It's a magic stone," whispered Caim, holding it out in front of him. His eyes suddenly widened. "We did it! We didn't drop them!" Storm smiled at the accomplishment. "Now place each of those stones into your bowls of water," instructed Ronin. "Then hold the bowl in your hands and close your eyes." Both Caim and Storm did as he asked. "Next comes the binding of your aura to the whetstones themselves. Focus on the energy in your bodies, the energy that is yours and yours alone. When you have found it and have control over it, I want you to pass a little of your aura into the bowls of water." As Storm and Caim focused, the bowls of water in their hands began to glow. For Caim, it was a bright shade of blue, whereas for Storm, it burned red like flame. With their eyes closed, they could feel steam rising up and touching their cheeks. "Open your eyes," said Ronin, finally. Storm opened his eyes to find that all the water in the bowl had evaporated, leaving only the newly glowing whetstone at the bottom. He picked it up carefully, feeling his own aura coursing through it. Little strands of red energy ran around the edges of the stone, and the sight of it awed him. Ronin stood to his feet, nodding his head. "There is something else you must do before you are given your swords," he said. "I need to show you something I have never shown you before." Ronin began walking towards the cabin. Caim and Storm eagerly followed him, taking chances to peek at one another's stone in the process. "I wonder what it is we have to do now," said Caim. "Don't get too excited," said Storm. "There's always a catch with the old man. He's never been one to give out handouts." As the two boys passed into the cabin, Storm noticed the tall rectangular metal box leaning against the side of the wall. He glanced at it momentarily before following his brother through the bamboo drapes of the doorway. Upon entering the cabin, Caim and Storm stopped as they watched Ronin finish moving the wooden table away from its place by the floor. Running his fingers through the seams of the cracks, Ronin found what it was he was looking for and pressed down with his body weight. A loud click could be heard, and the two boys stared oddly as Ronin lifted up a wooden trapdoor. The old man turned, then motioned for them to follow. Caim and Storm looked at each other in wonder before walking over to the trapdoor. A long ladder descended into darkness, and the two boys began following their grandfather down to whatever was at the bottom of it. Caim and Storm soon reached the bottom, only to find themselves standing in a pitch-black room. Trying to make sense of their surroundings, Ronin lit a candle. He then proceeded to light several other candles until the light began to leak out and into the room. Storm and Caim gasped in astonishment. The room was bordered by the rock of the island and was otherwise empty, save for the dozens upon dozens of swords dangling in the air by ribbons clasped to hooks in the ceiling. "You've had this here all along?" muttered Storm, gazing around at the graveyard of swords. "How could you have hidden this from us?" Caim was completely speechless as he walked from sword to sword, taking in their beauty. "I stopped coming down here when you were still babies," said Ronin. "I figured that if I tried to come down into this chamber when you were older, you boys would have eventually found it. Besides, I knew the time would come when you would be ready to see it for yourselves." Storm nodded his head as he moved from sword to sword. He didn't touch any of them, but noticed they were all quite different. There were rapiers and claymores and katanas and longswords. Each and every one of them had felt the touch of a swordsman's hand, and the idea that something like this could exist beneath his home bewildered him. Ronin walked back to the ladder and stopped. "Your last trial is to find which of these swords is yours, and bring it to me when you have. I'll be waiting by the fire for you. Choose wisely, for there is only one sword that is meant to be held by your hand." At that, Ronin climbed up the ladder and left the brothers in silence. For a long time, they wandered around, examining each of the blades with the utmost care. Storm found that all the blades could be unclasped from the ribbons so that they could be held by hand. After feeling out at least a dozen of the blades, Storm sat down on the ground. He watched as Caim went from blade to blade in the same fashion, but without any luck. Caim soon came over and sat next to Storm on the ground. "How are we supposed to choose?" Caim asked. "I told you not to get your hopes up," said Storm. "I knew he would pull something like this. You knew he was gonna do this? Storm sighed. Caim, no, not exactly this, but some sort of daunting task. You know him. Caim leaned back on his arms and felt his whetstone fall out of his pocket. They both heard it, and at the same time, their eyes lit up. The whetstones, they said in unison. They're the key to finding our swords, Storm said, taking his out of his pocket. The two brothers then began their circle around the room once again, holding their whetstones tightly within their hands. But with every sword they held, there was still no answer, no feeling that what they were holding was the right one. After nearly a shade had passed, Storm let out a breath of air. Maybe we should just pick one already, he said. He didn't tell us how we were supposed to do this, after all. Maybe it's just the one that we decide that happens to be the right one. Caim was closing his eyes while holding the hilt of a scimitar. Not this one either, he muttered, carefully placing it back where he had found it. Caim, did you hear me? Yeah. It's weird. Almost like I can feel a small amount of connection to all of them, but nothing rings true. And these are all swords that have been used already. So wouldn't they belong to other swordsmen? Storm looked back at his brother. Obviously they belong to other swordsmen, but now they are being passed on to... He paused, looking down at his whetstone. What is it? Caim asked. Has your whetstone been used at all? Caim looked down at his. Doesn't look like it. Didn't he say that every sword tempered is created with a whetstone to match it? Caim's eyes lit up. That means... He stopped. What does that mean? It means our swords aren't in here. Storm turned back to the ladder. He was testing us to see if we would choose one out of impatience instead of waiting for the right one. Then that means, Caim said, looking back at the ladder. Wait, what does that mean? He has them up at the fire, Storm said, finding clarity in his choice. The two boys quickly made their way up the ladder and out of the trap door. A strange feeling of trepidation swam through Storm's heart as he walked out of the cabin. The fire was burning fiercer than before. And there, just sitting beyond it, was the silhouetted figure of Ronin. Storm and Caim made their way to the fire, slowing their pace as they approached. There were no swords to be seen anywhere, and the feeling that Storm might be wrong sent his heart racing. Laying across Ronin's lap was his wooden cane. Well, Ronin asked, gazing up at the two boys. You've returned with nothing. Caim gulped. Our swords aren't in there. And if they were, added Storm, maybe we aren't ready to have them yet. Ronin took a long sip of his wine, then stared at the two boys for a good, long moment. I would be lying if I told you I haven't been anticipating the moment you boys earn your first real swords, Ronin said. It's been nearly 10 cycles since I first started training you, and to see both of you develop as you have, learning to embody the subtle philosophies of the swordsman as you grew, has been quite the journey. Ronin paused for a second before continuing. The thought of waiting a cycle to give you another chance was a grievous decision to make, but one that could not be avoided. Storm and Caim lowered their heads, unable to speak. That is why I am relieved that you boys did not choose one of the swords from my chamber. The brothers looked up slowly. Because you were right. None of those swords were meant to be yours. Ronin could no longer suppress his smile. I am proud to say that you boys have passed the test, and that now is the time for you to acquire your first swords, the swords that will officially take you boys from apprentice swordsmen to the real thing. Really? Caim said, unable to hold back his enthusiasm. He looked at Storm, who smiled and held up his fist. We did it! Not quite, said Ronin. There is one last thing you must do. Of course there is, muttered Storm. Are you ready? I'm always ready. I hope so, Ronin said, and Storm looked at him strangely. Ronin stood and walked to the cliff looking out from their island. Caim and Storm came and stood on each side of him. Looking out from where they were, they could see the edge of Folia, dark and mighty, staring back at them. Each of your swords has been pierced into the ground on the edge, said Ronin. Do you see them? Caim and Storm looked closer to find two shimmering glints reflecting the light of the moons. One was long and sleek, while the second was not as tall, but several times wider and clearly heavier. I see them, Caim exclaimed, squinting. Now, said Ronin, the time has come. Focus on the energy of your whetstones. Find the energy that resides within them and use it to see which sword is your own. Remember how you learned to hunt? You must become like water, allowing yourself to take the shape of your environment. This is not so different, as you must match your energy to the appropriate sword. Then, the only thing you will have to do is call it, and the sword, If it is meant to be yours, we'll answer. If you succeed, meet me on the tip of the edge." Ronin's feet lifted off the ground and he floated across the sky, his long black cloak whipping out behind him. They watched him land next to a small tree, and Storm noticed that the long rectangular metal box was leaning against it. "We can do this," said Caim, staring out over the two blades. Together, the two of them took hold of their whetstones and closed their eyes. They could feel the energy of the stone like static electricity within their palms, and the more they focused, the more the stone seemed to come alive. With his eyes closed, Storm could only see darkness. He settled himself into a state of openness, thinking at first of the grass and the wind before switching to the whetstone. The more he focused on the aura of the stone, the more something began to take shape in his mind. At first, it was but a small flame, timid and shy, but the more he reached out for it, the more the flame began to burn until it slowly took the shape of a sword. It was lean and sleek and beautiful, and holding out his hand, Storm whispered on the passing breeze. "Come," he said, his voice quiet and tranquil, full of hope. He felt the blurred blade stirring in the earth, quivering back and forth, hearing his call. "Come to me," he said once again, his voice full of strength and passion. When he opened his eyes, Storm looked down to find himself holding the hilt of a dark, slender blade. It had a slight curve to it, and the blade itself was of the darkest metal. It was cold as winter, and beautiful as the falling of leaves in autumn. The feel of it in his hand was unrivaled. He looked over to see Caim still standing there with his eyes closed and his hands stretched out. Storm could faintly see his brother whispering something on the wind, but couldn't discern what it was. He grinned, remembering Caim's difficulties with the more subtler techniques. "Focus on yourself first," whispered Storm. "That might help. You can't force it." After a bit of struggling and whisper cursing, Caim finally found himself holding his blade. It was unique in its shape and form, with the width rivaling that of the biggest claymore. Yet the blade itself was not long, perhaps only 2 feet in length. Staring oddly at the hilt, Storm noticed that it was almost twice as long as his own. "Storm," Caim gasped. "It's a fall blade. I can't believe it's a fall blade." Storm's eyes widened. He knew the sword Caim had received was rare amongst the rare. The original fall blades had only ever been gifted to the greatest of swordsmen, including Lord Fall, one of the most famous swordsmen of all their myths. He looked back at his own sword and smiled, for he could not have asked for anything better. It would fit his swift style perfectly, and just by holding it, he could barely contain the childish desire to swing it through the air. "Come on," said Caim, looking back at Ronin. Storm nodded, and the two brothers leapt across the sky, landing softly on the edge. They walked up to find Ronin sitting with his legs crossed. Laid out on the ground before him was the rectangular metal box Storm had seen him return with earlier. It was open, revealing to them 2 sheaths perfectly fit to their newly acquired swords. "Take your sheaths," said Ronin, "and lay them next to you on the ground." The two brothers carefully took the sheaths out of the box, admiring the craftsmanship before laying them out beside them. "There is one last thing," said Ronin. "Take a seat, cross your legs, and listen." They did as they were told and watched as Ronin pulled out his long wooden cane. Grasping the hilt of it, he pulled forth a perfectly straight long blade. He pierced the tip of the blade into the earth between them. "I must say I am quite pleased with you boys surviving all of the trials that I have had you do over the cycles. From hunting the beast within Neverend to climbing the most difficult of climbs, I have seen you surpass all challenges with remarkable talent. You have faced the flames, conquered Earth, and learned to become fluid and adaptable, like water." Storm and Caim bowed their heads to their master. "It is time," said Ronin, studying each of them. "Your final test of swordsmanship will not be in a week. It will be now." "But," Storm started. Ronin held up his hand, silencing him. "I'm sorry, Storm. I understand that you are exhausted from your training earlier today and from climbing Asangate, but there is no other choice. A swordsman must always be ready at any point in time, no matter how fatigued or worn out they are. That is why your final test will take place when you least expected it, to prove that under any circumstances, no matter how bad the odds, you boys can persevere. It is a good thing to be able to overcome challenges when you are fresh and ready, but it is another thing entirely to be able to overcome something when you are least prepared for it." Storm gritted his teeth, feeling the strain in his muscles and his hands. He was nowhere near fully rested, and although the meal he had eaten after climbing had helped him somewhat, he couldn't help but feel like the old man was being unfair. Caim looked at Storm despairingly, knowing his condition. Storm clenched tightly to the hilt of his sword, feeling anger burning up within. Why did it always feel like he got the short end of the stick? "Now," said Ronin, "we will begin. Take each of your swords and pierce them into the ground. Make sure that the blades are crossed and touching mine when you do it, or this will not work." A sudden feeling of angst came over Storm in realization. "You don't mean—" "Yes," said Ronin, his voice radiating his resolve. "Your final test will be within my inner depths. Over the cycles, you boys have learned the early stages of this technique, and each of you has ventured into your own individual inner depths several times. However, this time, I will be bringing you into my own world, and it is there that you will be tested. There will be no second chances." "No second chances?" Storm protested, his emotion causing his words to be sharper than expected. Ronin looked at Storm sternly, but said nothing. It was a look that made it clear there was no other option. Caim took a deep breath and pierced his blade into the ground next to Ronin's. He turned to look at Storm. "Come on, Storm, we can do this. We'll do it together." "Together?" Storm retaliated. He glared at the old man as he pierced his blade into the ground. Hard. "Fine then. I'm gonna beat you once and for all and prove that I surpassed you long ago." Storm took a seat next to Caim and crossed his legs. "The final stepping stone is one you are familiar with," said Ronin. He turned his palms up. "Air." They watched as Ronin floated up and off the ground until he was level with the hilts of the blades. "Now rise." Caim closed his eyes and focused. A few moments later, Storm watched as his brother lifted up until he was floating evenly with Ronin. Storm turned his head away, holding back all the dark things he wanted to say. Flying was the most difficult ability he ever had to learn, and he hated looking bad doing anything in front of others. "Storm?" Ronin asked. Storm let out a frustrated sigh and closed his eyes. He held his hands together and felt his body lift off the ground, but upon realizing it, fell back down. He pursed his lips and tried again, but once again, fell. "This is stupid," said Storm. "You can do it," said Caim. "Just focus." Closing his eyes once again, Storm forced away all negative thoughts and listened to the wind. It was soothing on his angry spirit, and before he knew it, he felt it lifting himself up as if he weighed nothing at all. Opening his eyes to find himself level with the other two, Storm glared at Ronin. "Now then," said the old man, pulling 2 bells out of his pocket. Storm watched them carefully, wondering what he was devising. Ronin attached the first bell to the right side of his sash, followed by attaching the second bell to his left side. "This is a trial of teamwork," declared Ronin, "one that can only be completed by working together. Sorry to get in the way of your vendetta against me, Storm, but you'll have to work with your brother if you want to beat me. The test is simple. All you must do is take these bells from me, and you pass. However, each of you will have to pull a bell from my side at the same time, or they will not come free." Storm eyed the traces of Ronin's aura circulating around the 2 bells. He knew it would be impossible to take them both from him at the same time, or close to. Ronin closed his eyes. Caim followed suit, and Storm reluctantly after the 2. Despite all his anger toward Ronin, Storm knew that he would have to pull something out of his sleeve to surpass the test. Clenching his fists hard, he could feel the incredible strain his body had gone through. He was not even close to being in the condition necessary to face off against the old man. No matter how much he hated it, their grandfather was still the strongest swordsman they had ever known. A grin curved Ronin's lip. "Shall we?"